So it's recording. So and I'll have to open up the screen. So I'll take over your screens, and that's the wrong image. So that's the first image, and this is the slideshow. Okay, so this talk started off as being about Five Eyes, but sort of morphed into US bases in Australia. The first thing to remember is that there is a deep national consensus that the US bases are very important to Australia's security. And I've taken this rather long quote from a friend of ours, Vincent Scapatura, who's written a book called The US Lobby and the Australian Defence Policy. And he said that global research suggests that political opponents and social movements who have attempted to challenge the pro-US stance of their national governments are much less likely to be successful when a broad and deep national consensus exists about the centrality of the nation's alliance with the United States. So it's very difficult to push the bases out once they're here. And another author, Clinton Fernandez, says the national interest requires a political system to satisfy private concentrations of power and wealth, because the system stops if they stop investing. And this is the enduring reality. This enduring reality underpins Australia's foreign policy. So you've got the two issues there of the elite and the national consensus being that we need the United States. And then along comes Malcolm Fraser, who many of you would remember as being quite pro-United States. He died a couple of years ago, but he was the Prime Minister, and before being Prime Minister, he was the Minister for the Army, and he sent Australian troops to Vietnam. So he was completely part of the establishment, where he and then he had an experience. He changed his mind completely, and he wrote a book called Dangerous Allies. And the allies he was referring to was sorry, there's somebody else coming in again. The allies he's referring to was, first of all, Britain, and then now the United States. And this is a blurb from the cover of his book called Dangerous Allies. And Malcolm Fraser argued that Australia should adopt a much greater degree of independence in foreign policy, and that we should no longer merely follow other nations into war of no direct interest to Australia or Australia's security. He argues for an end to the strategic dependence and for a timely establishment of a truly independent Australia. And the reason he changed his mind was that he became aware that Pine Gap was facilitating drone attacks on people in various parts of the Middle East, so that it was possible for somebody in a base in New Mexico in the United States to go to work in the morning and get a drone to fly over some part of Somalia or Afghanistan or somewhere else and fire off a rather drastic missile that would kill 2 or 3 people and injure maybe 10 others standing nearby. And during the Obama administration, there's estimated that 8,000 people were killed. And then Pine Gap became involved with missile defence. So it always was regarded as a target But to him, these were the two things that changed his mind. That Australia became, that he thought Pine Gap originally was for defensive purposes, and then he saw it as being an offensive base. So that's why he changed his mind. So from those couple of authors, non-communist authors, you get these 3 points. There is a consensus in Australia that the US will save us should we get into, should somebody attack us. Now, we say that that's a false concern, because there's no one who really wants to attack us and could attack us, because we're in a very strong strategic position, living on an island, a rather large, the largest island in the world, or second largest, whatever, depending. I think Greenland might be bigger or something, one of those. But anyway, and then the elite and the very wealthy want to be on the winning side in any confrontation, and they've decided that the United States is going to be the winner. So there's bipartisan agreement, and by that I mean both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, and what they call the coalition. Both of them say that the United States are going to win, and they make sure that they do everything they possibly can to support the United States. And the third thing is Australia is willing to do almost anything to keep the US involved down here. So this, I'd have about 5 or 6 or 8 or 9 of these sort of comics, these cartoons, where Australia has, kissing the hem of the United States. That's a cartoon of Hawke, but I've got one of Howard with a brown nose. I've got ones with Julia Gillard and so on. You must remember that Julia Gillard was on Q&A last night, and she was the one who introduced the Marines into Darwin. So so we could put the head of any Prime Minister, Rudd, Gillard, Labor, Liberal, they're all been the same. So this is what we're up against. So the US bases in Australia, the strong US-Australian relations started in World War II. And then after World War II, the US lost interest in Australia till around about the end of the 40s. And around 1951, with a lot of help from Menzies, Australia was corralled into signing, or Australia corralled the United States into signing the ANZUS Treaty. But it's not really till the 60s where the US gets very, very interested in Australia and sees the potential. So in 1963, they open up Northwest Cape. In 66, they open up Pine Gap. And then after every Prime Minister after Menzies adds to the total of US facilities in Australia. As far as I know, Morrison has not added to the total, but would probably like to. The total is now nearing the 50 bases, 50 US bases in Australia, and a lot of people express surprise at that. But that's a pretty realistic figure. This map isn't very clear, it's very hazy, but it shows bases in just about every state in Australia except South Australia, and that's where it's inaccurate. But you get a sense of how many, if you tried to put all the bases on Australia, it starts looking like, a mad dog's breakfast. So, but there's just gives you some of the idea of some of the bases that are in Australia, and it's quite a large number. And one of the key things that happened in the Hawke era was that he signed a document which said that the United States could use any base, any Australian military base that the Americans felt they needed at any time. So Richmond RAAF base is used quite often by the United States Air Force. The naval facilities at various ports in from our comrades in Perth know well about that. So all these facilities are at the disposal of the United States military. Okay, so the US bases' roles in Australia are they gather intelligence, and by that I mean they gather information from mobile phones, from emails, from ordinary telephone calls, from faxes, from any sort of electronic intelligence you can think of. You know, they have put backdoors in all the social medias, Google, Yahoo, all these, as well as gathering information about military signals and so on. Welcome to Julie.
Hi, Julie.
So, and they also collect targeting information, so that if they were interested in a certain country, they can look at it from a whole lot of regions. They can look at it photographically. They can look at it from where all the signals coming from. They can look at it even from an infrared. So they have devices that will look at countries and check those countries out. And they can use all this information to facilitate drone attacks, as I said earlier. They use that infrared information for missile defense. They have photographic surveillance. They have surveillance of the surface of the Earth, so that if they notice that somebody is building a rather large building somewhere, they know about it, because they can see the changing structure of the Earth, because they have been taking photographs of it. And now they have training bases and bases for the military. I'm avoiding saying much about Darwin, because I know there's going to be another talk about Darwin. But this is what the US bases do in Australia, and they also have a base near, again for our West Australians, at Kojima, behind, I'm not sure I pronounce that properly, behind I've just forgotten the name of the town in Western Australia. No, I just can't remember it. Anyway, they have a combat structure where they can, where commanders in the field can communicate with their superiors in Washington and vice versa. They can say, look, you're climbing up such and such a hill, we can tell you what's on the other side. So they've got all these sorts of roles. Then they're all in Australia. And
Dennis?
Yeah?
Excuse me. Could you go back to the map and point out where Pine Gap is? Because maybe not everybody knows. And you talked about Codrina, and maybe you could point out, it's near Geraldton, isn't it?
Geraldton, yeah. So Pine Gap is near Alice Springs in this area, and Kojima is here, and Exmouth, Northwest Cape is here. So,
thank you.
So anyway, so that's the US bases roles. So now the US reasons for staying in Australia it gives them a very good strategic position between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It's now common for them to hear them talk about the Indo-Pacific. They also have cheap, stable facilities, so that they know that there's not going to be a sudden revolutionary government that come to power in Australia at the moment. I wish there was, but there doesn't seem to be a prospect at the moment. So they know they've got that, and they, apart from paying their own salaries, they don't pay any rent to Australia or Australia's the Australian government. They don't pay any rent to the Australian Aboriginal people, First Nations. And they also means that they're inside the country, so they have a chance to have some control, internal control on this country. And it's quite, I think a lot of people would accept this, that the country is now so important to the US that should an anti-US government arise in Australia, that government would suffer a coup, somewhat similar to the way Whitlam was dealt with. So that's the United States reasons, and the you can see in this very rudimentary map that you can see Australia, where Australia is in relation to Asia, and that these countries, India and China, are going to be the next powerhouse for economic growth. And the United States has got a really strong foothold in Australia, and it's not going to get out of here without a great deal of persuasion. And while we're in here, I very quickly, and not entirely accurately, but I quickly put down the new bases that the United States has built over the last 10 years. And we hear wall-to-wall explanations about what the terrible Chinese people have done in the South China Sea. But we never hear about the new bases they've built in Japan, in South Korea, the absolutely massive base they've built in Guam, in the Philippines, and that the United States has said that they have now got control of the Malacca Straits, and they call that a choke point. So that should they wish to stop oil flowing from the Middle East into China, all they have to do is close that strait there.
Can you show that on the map, Dennis?
Sorry, that strait here. So should they wish to stop oil flowing from the Middle East here, through here to China, they could stop it here. And they also have a choke point up here as well. So should the transports come this way, they can choke it off there as well. So, and they boasted about that about 10 years ago. And but this is never mentioned when they're talking about the South Sea, South China Sea. Anyway, that's another issue. Now, Australia itself has good reasons for keeping the US bases. It can shelter behind them and sort of feel a lot more secure. We think it's a false sense of security, but a lot of people feel that would be that the Americans will come to save their bases. Australian prime ministers get to feel important and get invited to see the president and go to their ranch and so on, as John Howard did. We get access to the US military equipment and to information. Some people say US military equipment is a lot of junk, but it's incredibly expensive junk. There are real dangers for Australia which are not recognised or talked about. So, for example, there was a group of lawyers in Pakistan who were getting a case together against Australia for being complicit in the drone attacks on the people on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, so that we could find ourselves up before courts, international courts for war crimes. We're told that should a conflict break out, the first thing that would be targeted would be Pine Gap, with several supersonic missiles that no missile defence can stop, so that there would be the people living not far from Pine Gap. Pine Gap's 20k from Alice Springs would be endangered, and then our international status is harmed when we're seen as being not being independent, but more of a mouthpiece of the United States. So, in to just talk about the resistance to US bases, this this pamphlet was written in 1948 by the president, the secretary of the Communist Party, Lance Sharkey, and in that he said, "No one menaces us with aggression. Why then do we need a military pact with the American government of big business and brass hats?" This is immediately after the war, and this is this 1948 sort of language, but you can get any war these gentries engaged in cannot, in the nature of things, be other than a war of imperialist aggression and an unjust war. Those who want peace must oppose military pacts with the imperialist powers and insist that the proper working of the UN is Australia's best safeguard. So that's way back in 1948. And that's as true today as it was then, in my humble opinion. So the campaign against US bases here, well, it starts in the 1940s with that sort of rhetoric from the Communist Party, and among, well, it wasn't entirely the Communist Party. There were general rallies in the 50s and 60s against the Korean and Vietnam wars. In the 1970s, there was a national campaign created by a group called the Maoists, who devised this great long march using buses that went across the country from the eastern states. And they stopped at Pine Gap and they drove across the West Australian border. The West Australian government at the time said that they would not allow them across the border, but they did cross the border and they drove all the way up to Northwest Cape. In 1984, at the height of the scare about nuclear weapons in Europe, there was a women's camp at Pine Gap, which was very well attended. And in 1987, there was the foundation of the Australian Anti-Bases campaign. So there's been an ongoing campaign against US bases. No one has sat back and let them have all their own way. So in the beginning, we had closed debate. This is in 1987. That was the logo for the Anti-Bases campaign on the left, the Aboriginal colours one with the close the bases. And there's another coalition of which the Anti-Bases is both a supporter of and a member of, called IPAN, which has taken on a bit of a role against the troops in Darwin and against bases in general. So they're gradually getting to a stage where they may or may not take over the role of the Anti-Bases campaign. So IPAN stands for, as you can see, Independent and Peaceful Australia Network. So here is a little bit of glory from the anti-bases campaign. This is the rally at Narunga, which was in South Australia, and the young woman holding up the newspaper there. I don't know whether you can read the headline, but it says 150 arrests as troops fly in, and that on that occasion, by pure chance, one of the protesters broke into the base, and it became a bit of a national scandal. This is one of the cartoons from that time. And so on that occasion, Kim Beazley happened to be the defence minister, and he got very, very worried about how it would look to his friends in Washington. So he sent the troops in, and he sent the troops in, and it coincided with the grand finals of the AFL. So we wiped the AFL grand finals off the front pages of every Sunday paper, and it all became all this stuff, and people started talking about the bases for the first time in a rather generalised way. This created for a time a decrease in the support for US bases. Often the support for US bases has been as high as 84% in the Australian population. So it's quite a struggle. But the anti-bases campaign planned to get a demonstration at Pine Gap or another base every 2 years, and we did that on a budget of hardly anything, and but most of the time we did do something like that. Sometimes we concentrated our work on the US-Australia military exercises that were held from Rockhampton and then going up north. And then, but the campaign has continued. It's not something that has died. Of course, everything could do with a shot in the arm, but it still continues. So IPAN has taken on some of the work in recent years. So the challenge of US bases to all Australians at the moment is there was a time, a very small window, when there was a feeling that the government could be even-handed between the US and China, but that window seems to have been slammed shut, and now the government has come down squarely in favour of the US and created this incredible climate of fear of China. And but the challenge for us is we need to develop a very broad consensus that the US alliance and the bases does Australia more harm than good. So that's our challenge, and it seems at the moment to be very difficult with all this fear of China. That's a T-shirt we had made. So that's our challenge. Are we Australia or are we Australia? So we've tried all sorts of ways to put our point across about US bases. There's the gates of Pine Gap, and that particular banner here, which I'm pointing to here, this banner has been all over the world. It's been to Germany, it's been to Ecuador, it's been to different bases around Australia. It's been everywhere. It was painted by some of you might remember Jackie who died last Christmas. So it's still in the anti-bases office. Somebody put this, that's still in front of the Pine Gap. Somebody put that banner up, that thank you to Edward Snowden. I don't know whether you remember him, but he was the one the person who let the whistleblower who released thousands upon thousands of documents about what the US bases have done in Australia and all around the world. This book is about to come out in August, and it's about a group of Christians who have from time to time broken into Pine Gap and their trial. And this woman, Kieran Finane,
Hi, Grandma.
sorry?
Grandma.
Yeah,
All right.
keep going, Dennis.
Oh,
Keep
sorry.
going.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the mute button.
All right.
I've got my great-grandchild coming in.
All right. That's all right. Sorry then.
Puts me on the phone.
The writer, Kieran, that's a man, isn't it?
No, it's a woman. I thought it was a man too, but anyway, it was sort of.
It's a man's name.
I thought it was too, but it's actually a woman. I believe she's quite a very nice woman. Anyway, that book is about to come out in August, so people are encouraged to buy the book, and we might do something around that particular book. Here's the current campaign. That those of you who watch where the COVID virus is, notice that there's one in the Northern Territory, and that one is a US Marine. And so that's image I've been putting up on social media. So I don't think I need to explain it to you, but if you want me to, I will. So that's there's a picture of the offending base. So that's our task, comrades, to close Pine Gap. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dennis. Were you going to mention anything about Five Eyes, or?
No, I thought I'd restrict it to that. So.
Okay, that's fine. Are there any, thank you, are there any questions to start with, or comments?
Yeah, very, very clear. I liked all the points. It makes it clear to take note of it all, the way you've done it in points. Very clear.
And
very frightening.
we have recorded it if people want to use the recording as a sort of way of taking notes.
Oh, right. Yeah, I was taking that. When you say recorded it, as a video, or?
Yeah, it's recorded in 3 ways: as a video, as an audio, and I think, anyway, it's recorded in a number of ways.
And then how do we get it?
I could send it to you, or I can, I'll put it up on a Facebook page, or anyway.
Yeah, as an email or something.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Actually, you should sell it so that you can make some money for IPAN or something, you know.
Yeah, no, I don't think it'll be a bestseller yet.
I think in view of the anti-Chinese hysteria or demonization that the Morrison government is whipping up, it makes Pine Gap more important, because if the United States is going to stage provocations against China, and although China has shown great patience in the past, Pine Gap is going to be very important to the Americans to use against China. It's going to be very important to us, because if the Chinese have to knock it out, you know, wind blows radioactive dust everywhere across our land, and it's not going to be very pleasant at all. So, you know, to try at the moment to make some more noise about Pine Gap, I think is something very important for us to do, to try in any way we can, particularly through social media, because, you know, social media is where we can get a hearing. We need to disseminate some of this information again. You know, I often find when we talk to people about Pine Gap online at the moment, there's things like, oh yes, of course, I'd forgotten that. Because the high point of the campaign, you know, when every 2 years we were trespassing and getting arrested at bases, that's died down somewhat. You know, and a lot of the young energy and activity has gone into the environmental movement. And I don't, in one way, I don't mind that, because that is a immediate threat to our future. But so is stupidity by Morrison and Trump, if they so decide. So, you know, I think anybody who can pass on some of this information and point out that Pine Gap is really the most important base for the Americans outside ones in their homeland, that would be a really good thing to do at the moment, so that we are already trying to develop an anti-war feeling around the country rather than an anti-Chinese feeling.
Yeah. What's the position of the Chinese in the port of Darwin and military people and US military in Darwin?
Well, I'm not quite sure about that, because of course China owns the port of Darwin, but we invite US Marines in, and we will.
So that was, sorry, could I just
go on? Yes, sure.
Well, I'm sorry. I just realised that the United States is so worried about the fact that Chinese own the port that they are going to create another naval base so that they can come through. So that might be Morrison's swan song, that he created another base. So another US Navy base, Australian US Navy base, not far from the port, but quite separate and quite could be hidden from Chinese view should the risk arise. So that's being talked about, but it hasn't. There's no news on it yet, but it's been talked about, and the possibility is there.
The map showing the American bases all around, you know, from Korea, Japan, right down there, is very interesting, because the way the press has it, it's that China is the imperialist and is spreading everywhere, and yet we never hear about all this line around them.
That's right. Yeah, it's very. And
that'd be a good map to sort of print on a postcard or something, and you know,
I do have
China,
a good.
Where is China's aggression, or where is US aggression? You know.
Yeah.
I think there's a point to be made about what China is doing. There's no doubt that in the South China Sea, they are somewhat tougher than they've been in the past. But also at the same time, they're well aware that the Americans for about 6 or 7 years now have been having computer war games of their air-sea battle, which is really a war game about invading the Chinese mainland. You know, so China is obviously quite concerned about ensuring that it has some defense offshore as well as onshore. And it has been developing its navy for this purpose. And given how the Americans behave traditionally, and given how Trump behaves, I must say I can't blame them.
And in fact, they have a very long coastline on the east. It's an extremely long coastline, and it's not going to be easy to defend. And they've also been circled by the US in the countries all around the perimeter of China as well, with bases. So the US is really gearing up for a war. There's no doubt about that. It's just a matter of whether it's this year or 2 years' time or 4 years' time.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
Sure.
please.
In WA,
Exactly.
we're really promoting IPAN. We've got an IPAN WA branch, and we have a vigil every first Tuesday in the month outside Wesley Church, right in the middle of Perth. And we are promoting this sort of thinking. We put a flyer out and we tell people what the US is doing in Australia. So we're working on that. But of course, COVID-19 knocked us out for about 6 months, but we're starting up again in August.
Oh, congratulations. Who'd like to go next? Have you finished, Eileen? Sorry.
Sorry?
Did you want
I'm just
to say-
asking a question
just-
about.
Sylvia, hang on. Just check that Eileen has finished.
Yes, I have.
Okay, righto, go Sylvia.
Really embarrassed. I'm on a Zoom
I'm just wondering,
meeting.
the Spratly Islands, which is where the Chinese say belong to them,
Tomorrow.
and the Japanese claim ownership. Was there any Japanese reparations paid after the Second World War to China for the amount of damage that the Japanese had done in China? And if there wasn't any war reparations paid to China, would that be one of the reasons why China has claimed these islands?
I don't know the answer to whether any reparations were paid, Sylvia. I don't think it would be a reason for claiming the islands. I think China is looking to its defense, facing a particularly sort of difficult president in Trump. Very difficult to assess which way he's going to do and what he's going to do and so on. And also the knowledge that the Americans have planned an invasion. You know, so they are shoring up their defenses. And as Anna says, you know, they've got a very long shore to defend. They are building on islands in what they regard as their territorial waters. And they are trying to create a defense for themselves. I don't think it's about reparations at all. But whether Japan paid,
you know, if any reparations had been paid, because I mean Japan did awful damage in China. You know,
yeah,
so
let me ask the comrades on the, does anybody know if Japan paid reparations to China after the war?
They didn't.
They didn't.
No, because of the war between the nationalists and the communists in China immediately after the Second World War. They didn't know who to pay to.
Which was deliciously convenient for them.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
China was in a bit of uproar for 3 or 4 years after the Second World War. And so, yeah.
Okay, Sylvia, thank you, Julie.
thank
Sylvia,
you.
you've got your answer.
Yes.
Who'd like to go next?
Yes, comrade.
Ahmed?
Yes, comrade. Good evening, comrades. Despite the title of the discussion, which was Five Eyes, we didn't say anything what Five Eyes is, although I am sure comrades know what does mean by this thing, namely US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia are the Five Eyes. You know, they are the five countries which most of them, actually, beside the UK, almost all of them have been colonized by British Empire, and the native people have been eradicated, killed, massacred, genocide, and they have put their white man to suppress and oppress the natives. Whether it's Australia original, it's Canada, they're Indians, and New Zealand Maoris, and of course US, the Red Indians. They have been colonized, and nowadays we have these giant countries which they are the descendants of the Winston Churchill, what I can call them, you know. And they are all intelligence services. They help each other in all times. The only difference is sometimes New Zealand is little bit of reluctant to knee or accept U.S. dictate, like for instance, not allowing to put the nuclear bases or whatsoever in their homeland. So the Five Eyes are known, and Snowden has done quite information for the world, especially also WikiLeaks, which are very hard to find or go to their information because all blocked or you can't see them. So thank you very much. It was good information, and hopefully to hear more about these things and let the Australian public know about where is Pine Gap. And once we were giving leaflet away in town hall in this regard, and most of people didn't know where the Pine Gap is, where is the, this intelligent facility, which is a danger to Australian people and Australian land and their natives and etc. etc.
Thank you, Comrade Ahmed. Dennis, do you want to comment on Five Eyes and what Morrison wants to do with it?
Oh, just briefly, just go back a little bit. First of all, to the islands off Japan, which China claims, and so does Japan. There was a time when the Chinese government was fairly weak towards the end of the 1800s, and various countries were coming along and taking hunks of places that belonged to China, and Japan at the time took those islands, which are not very they're not very big places, and they're not very encouraging. They're not places that you can build much on, but still they do belong to China. And I happen to notice that Malcolm Fraser in his book said that Japan hasn't got a leg to stand on. They were taken by Japan when China was weak, and China's now the roles are reversed, and China's saying, "Hey, hand them back." So really, Japan's got no right to those. I think it's only 3 islands, but anyway, I don't think either side is going to go to war over them. But morally speaking, they are Chinese. But anyway, who's going to fight over that? In regard to Five Eyes, especially with these Black Lives Matter sort of protests, a lot of people are sort of saying that the Five Eyes is really a white supremacist organisation, and Ahmed is right in talking about how the British Empire and the United States, etc., decimated the people of colour in those areas, so that was one feature, and some of the comrades may know that in August, there's going to be a giant naval exercise called RIMPAC in Hawaii, and the indigenous people of Hawaii are sort of are talking about Five Eyes as being white supremacists, and also they're talking about the fact that their land is being bombed and strafed by Navy forces from around the Pacific, mainly white forces, and they're seeing it in a racist sort of tone. This whole interconnection of colonialism and militarism and so on, it just keeps continuing, and it's something we've been battling for 40 or 50 years ourselves. So it looks like we've still got a way to go. Thanks.
I think we should add that Five Eyes is directed against China currently, quite clearly.
Yeah.
And Morrison's, our Prime Minister Morrison's call for it to become also an economic unit,
Oh, that's right.
seems to us to be an effort to take those 5 mainly white capitalist imperialist powers and ensure that Australia can trade with them to reduce our reliance on China. Because of course, if we stop trading with China, we're not talking about recession or depression, we're talking about total economic collapse. Because China is so important to us economically. It's one of the reasons why, you know, the anti-Chinese demonization that's being whipped up is so utterly foolish in terms of the interests of the people of this country. You know, and Morrison is looking for alternative ways of finding trading relationships so he can undermine our dependence on China. And he's using Five Eyes for that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Okay, who'd like to go next? Any other comments? Everybody finished all their questions or comments or whatever? All right, comrades. Sorry. Then we've been going for almost an hour, and we never go over an hour and a half because most people seem to find being online for an hour and a half more than enough. It's not quite as easy as when you're talking to people face to face. So we'll finish this one now. Our next talk will be by Comrade Anna, and it's Where Do Profits Come From? A brief introduction to surplus value. So I hope comrades will join us for that one. And now I'd like to thank you all for coming on, to thank Dennis for his talk, and to say, as always, stay safe, everybody, stay well, and the pandemic will finally be overcome and we'll get back to real life. But hopefully we'll go on meeting online, because otherwise how would we meet comrades from Perth, you know, from different parts of Sydney or New South Wales, you know, and the Blue Mountains, you know. It's the one good thing about the pandemic is that we now understand how we can really talk with people everywhere in the world. And it's been, I think, a great advantage for us. And on our little Tuesday talks, we will continue using that benefit. So thank you, everybody, and bye-bye for now. See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you,
Dennis.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.